Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. We are talking about crisis planning for healthcare when things don't go according to plan. So I am joined here in the studio with Paul Fahey. He is the Vice President of Smith & Jones and has consulted with many hospitals and healthcare systems. And as we'll talk about today, has been brought on to deal with a wide variety of different crises. And we also just quickly want to shout out our colleague, Lisa Barone. She is the VP of Brand and also does amazing work building strong healthcare brands. And also a quick shout out to our studio engineer, Adam Claremont, who is running our stream today. So now I'm going to throw it over to Paul to break down the agenda.
Thanks, Katie, and welcome everybody. We've got a pretty robust audience joining us here on Zoom, but also this is being restreamed on our Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube platforms. So thank you to everybody that is joining us here today. So we'll go over to the slides and kind of take you through the agenda. So first, we'll talk about why we wanted to cover this topic. It's actually based on one of the chapters of our new book, second edition of Under the Influence. And it was really born out of a lot of the challenges that many of us and we saw our clients struggling with over the last couple years, the broader crises we were all dealing with. But we were also drawing from a lot of our experience, which we'll share with you in a second. So we thought this might be a good platform to have this conversation and share some of our experience and why in particular it's very important for our healthcare friends. So we'll start at the beginning with understanding how to recognize a crisis. Sounds pretty basic, but there are different types of crises, and some are easier to spot than others. There's a great acronym, PAIR. We'll tell you more about that in a minute. We'll focus a lot on media relations. That tends to be one of the places where your messaging is pushed out to the public, but we also have a few thoughts on social media platforms and those. So we'll try to make this as actionable, practical as possible. We've got a really diverse audience, mix of urban and rural and suburban hospitals, large, small organizations. So this may be new for some, refresher for others, but we thought, let's try to share as much as we can and make it as practical as possible. Please put any thoughts in the Q&A. Katie's going to be monitoring that as we go along. And thank you again, Katie, for helping to produce this event and all of our events in the series. So that's our agenda for today. We're also happy to make copies of these slides as well as our book available to folks that registered on Zoom. So we'll share those with you. Don't feel like you have to scramble and make screenshots, I think, throughout the course of the presentation. So what's keeping you up at night? How's the last few years been for all of us? Yeah, it's been a bit of a challenge. I know early on in March 2020, and even lately, it seems like we were watching sort of the COVID infection rates, much the same as we were looking at Barry Bonds' home run scores during any particular season. So with that in mind, does this sound familiar? Do we keep this event? Do we cancel it? Are we contributing to the hype? Should we push forward on a particular service line? We need the revenue. What's going to happen to our employees? Do we resume business as usual? All of that I think is relevant in the context of the COVID pandemic, but certainly, questions we should ask in any particular crisis. So I think these questions are things we've all asked ourselves, right? And that was just so 2020. Or was it? Looking at the recent infection rates, looks like we're dropping down a little bit, but nationwide, it certainly spiked again. We've been going through a lot of these different cycles. It's becoming a little bit more predictable. We're shifting the conversation from global pandemic to endemic, and so it looks like something that we could perhaps predict a little bit more in terms of the cycles. So this conversation won't be solely about the COVID pandemic, but many of us have organizations that have the potential to face crises on a very local level as well. And those could be anything from employees striking for a number of labor relations issues to vaccination or masking mandates. Any of these things could be happening on your sidewalk at a moment's notice. We work with clients that have had infectious outbreaks at a local level. We've had clients that have very adversarial media relations, patient suicides, different situations. I mean, there's a whole variety of things that can go wrong. Medical malpractice, working with clients, and trying to launch service lines in the shadow of a pretty, spectacular, incident. And on a personal level, at my former agency, yeah, our bookkeeper took almost $1 million. So we've even lived this and worked to try to manage our reputation, even on a personal level. So, we've been around the block. I've got the gray hair to prove it. And we're happy to share, from those perspectives and those experiences, some of the things that we'll go over with you this afternoon.
So a quick technical question. Someone asked, can we increase the audio volume? Adam, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. So Paul, why do you think crisis communication is so important, in particular to healthcare?
Yeah, healthcare is all about relationships. Trust and the quality of those engagements is the bedrock. It is the foundation of your organization's brand. And that's why, unlike perhaps a consumer product, that matters more than anything. Now, look, the good news is, as my friend Maggie has always taught me 20 years ago, you're on the side of angels. You are a very trusted member of your community. And with that in mind, preserving that reputation, preserving that brand is critical. How you handle yourself before, during, and after a crisis will really determine the quality of your brand equity, what the public thinks about you, whether or not they choose to trust you. And that could be on a clinical level, on whether I think they're telling me the truth, whatever those situations could be. So we'll return to the slides as we go through here now, and make sure that I've answered that question, because I can't see the slide on the screen. Standing by. And so that asset, isn't on a balance sheet the way that other assets are within a company or in an organization, but we believe your brand has equity. We believe your brand and that reputation needs to be protected and nurtured as much as any other bricks or mortar asset. And so again, as I mentioned before, the trust that's built up, being the foundation of your brand, makes it so much more important to handle these situations properly. And again, as I was describing a moment ago, people do remember how you handled a crisis long before the details of the crisis itself. Long-term damage is done before and after a crisis more so than during it. The proactive communications can give you at least a little bit of control over the situation, or at least the control over the type of messaging and how you're responding and engaging with your various audiences. One of our tips today is just keeping in mind that the need for crisis communications grows the longer the crisis lasts. If you have a one-day, issue story, that's different than if you have, so if you have an employee that comes out, stands out in front, has something that they want to say to the public and says it, that's different than a labor relations picket that is going on for weeks and weeks on end. And the news media itself, very much is, like us, a trusted resource. There's a lot of credibility that goes through journalism and through the reporters and editors that we work with. And with that in mind, it has a significant impact on the public's perception of an organization's reputation. How you carry yourself in the media, in many ways, carries more weight than how you carry yourself on your own social media platform, for instance.
Okay, so let's go back to the basics. How exactly would you define a crisis? Because for me, a crisis might be I just can't figure out what to cook for dinner, but it's a little different when it comes to healthcare organizations. So how would you actually define a crisis?
Sure. I think in its most simple definition, a crisis is any adverse event that is a distraction from your business's mission, core competency, the plans and the things that you're looking to advance. For those of you with really good screen resolution, a crisis could be me spilling grease all over my hand and going from there. But I think in all seriousness, it's anything that's going to distract you from keeping your organization moving forward. They come in various sizes and various types, and we'll walk through how to spot a crisis. It's not always as simple as it sounds, and we break it up into two different categories. The first, I think, as we return to the slides, is a sudden crisis. So as I was defining and answering Katie's question, it's anything that threatens to undermine that relationship with stakeholders and negatively affects your business. We break it into two different types of crisis, and I think it's important to understand that. Sometimes it's very obvious. Others may be a little harder to spot. But coming into a project with a client where they're saying, hey, we think we've got an issue here, we want to know how to handle this, we start at the beginning. What category does this fall within? So two different types, sudden and smoldering. A sudden crisis, maybe these are about 30% of the projects we work on, or they don't always fall into this category. Most things are what we would call smoldering. So this could be a mass shooting, it could be a fire, something else like that. There's an initial sense of chaos, there are aftershocks. You can prepare for them in terms of being ready to respond to something that happens acutely. Like all crises and some of the themes that you'll see us go through today's presentation, establishing the facts quickly, using consistent messages on all platforms, media, social media, employee conversations, all of that I think is essential. And responding quickly. This is and has been a 24-hour news cycle. Things are scooped even faster on social media. Reporters are even scooping themselves on social media before things go out on their websites or their print editions or on broadcast. And being ready for that constant stream of updates is important. And we'll talk about the role of social media as we go through. Updates, very often, you cannot over-communicate during a crisis. If there's nothing else that you take away from this, it's the PAIR acronym we'll talk about in a minute, and this concept of over-communicating. Sharing updates, immediately, hourly, whatever it is, even if you have nothing else to report, just putting yourself out there on social media or an update on your website saying, we don't have any additional information, but we're going to keep in touch with you, throughout the evening or whatever else is happening. Winston Churchill was very famous for saying, and we carry this quote around with us, that when eagles are silent, the parrots begin to jabber. Meaning if there's a vacuum, it's going to be filled by the nonsense, by the negative, by speculation. The more you're out there, the more consistently and more frequently you're out there with the facts, with a very human response to what's happening, the better off you'll be, and it'll kind of quell all of those, issues that can bubble up during a crisis. So the second type of crisis is smoldering. This is something that happens slowly, it happens over time. I don't think on March, whatever we call it, 13th, 15th of 2020, any of us knew what we were, in store ahead. In fact, I was famously, my colleagues remind me, I was famously saying, I think we'll be done with this by June or July. It's probably something that'll go through its own cycle and we'll be back to normal. So. But things like the coronavirus or an embezzlement, budget issues that might happen on a particular project, they're much more likely to occur than a sudden crisis. Little harder to identify in those earlier stages. And it's very easy for leaders to either avoid or misjudge or misunderstand the potential severity of what's happening ahead and the impact of it. Human errors can sometimes be not only a part of the crisis, but also, happen during the inability to recognize the crisis, and that delays the reaction. Sometimes they go away on their own. And all of these, reflect on the quality and ability of leadership. This is the time when you're tested more so than you ever have been. Your ability to harness the talent on your team, to respond to the situation, to gather the facts, communicate externally, and move forward into resolving whatever the particular crisis is really the true test of a lot of leadership within any organization.
So one of the biggest challenges with crisis and crisis planning is sometimes you can't really plan for them because they happen unexpectedly. So what are some of the strategies that you can use to plan for a crisis?
Yeah, great question. And we knew it was coming because it's on our next slide. You certainly cannot predict, but you can prepare. And I think that's an important difference. Preparing for the media, preparing for your messaging, how you're going to communicate and engage your various audiences, you can prepare for that. And we recommend that clients do that. Go through media training. If you haven't done it, have a crisis communication plan, have an internal news code. Who should be at the table when we've declared a crisis, and that's usually your C-suite, but depending on the situation, it could be internal and external counsel, certainly the folks in communications, public relations, however it's defined within your organization. But then it could be the different subject matter experts depending on what's happening. It could be folks from the outside, other community members that you're engaging, whether it's law enforcement or fire department or community opinion leaders if there's an issue. A lot of civic groups can help guide your organization into the right solutions. So preparing, and we put this under the heading of preparing for the media because that's usually where there's the most at stake and you're least in control necessarily. You don't have the control over the questions you're going to be asked or what ultimately gets edited into the news clip. So to Katie's point, you can prepare generically and then, but not predict. So, keeping in mind about first being aware that you may not always be aware of what's happening. Many times we've had clients that receive a call from a reporter saying, hey, I just heard about this thing. Sometimes it's good news. I heard, congratulations on your health grades report. Oh, I didn't know that was us. And that can turn into a crisis. Gosh, we didn't, even think we were that good. Mm-hmm. So they could know about it before you did. The satellite trucks can be rolling up onto your driveway. It could be adversarial depending on the type of the reporter, the nature of the story. There are occasions when the news wants to, view people like us as the spin doctor and putting the right person out in a situation. We'll talk about this as we go through. And certainly the public, and this is just human nature in general, want to assign blame. They want to know if something bad happened, who was responsible from it, and will we learn our lessons to make sure it doesn't happen again. So I promised you this PAIR acronym, and again, if you don't take anything else away from this, it's we use the acronym PAIR to reinforce what we talk about, when we talk about it, and in what order. And that's extremely important in any crisis. How you deal with a crisis, there's our cute little pair in the corner. How you deal with a crisis is pretty much the same way that you would talk or communicate about a crisis. So the PAIR acronym stands for people, environment, assets, and reputation. That's the order that you would deal with and prioritize something during a crisis. So pretend that there's a building on fire. You would get the people out first. Then you would look at the environment and say, I want to make sure, the house next door doesn't catch on fire. How can we prevent that? Then you focus on putting your own house out. And then lastly, you worry about your reputation. How did the fire start? Whatever else you could have there. So people, environment, assets, and reputation. That's the order in which how you would actually handle something in a crisis, and that's the order in which you should handle or speak and communicate and message during a crisis. And here's an example of not doing that all that well. So, Katie, they actually made a movie about this. The Deepwater Horizon issue, I think it was 2011 or so. Their CEO, Tony Hayward, was very famous during this saying and had a very insensitive comment. He said, we've been dealing with this, we just want to get back to business. I want my life back. Forgetting that 11 of his employees died on his oil rig. By not putting people first, by putting the public, his employees, by being essentially selfish with that comment and insensitive, really came back to hurt him. And that was a good example of him kind of going out of order, putting himself before employees or thinking about, assets before, people. So going in that order of PAIR, people, environment, assets, and reputation is extremely important.
Also, what's interesting with that too, when you think about it from branding, I don't think that their brand has recovered, and it's been over 10 years. So really something to think about, that just a small comment could have years of damaging results. So
exactly. And that goes back to our comment earlier. People will remember you long after the crisis is over for how you handled the crisis rather than the crisis itself. To your point, Katie, I don't think anybody knows, well, what happened? What was the technology failure that led to the blowout, that led to these deaths? Nobody really cares about that. They just remember the insensitive comments from the organization's leadership.
Yeah. Yeah, so this whole topic of dealing with the media is really interesting to me, but also adding in the aspect of social media, which we're going to talk about next, because now you have just normal, everyday people who can also offer their own commentary, whether they're experts or just random Joe off the street. So that adds a whole nother layer to all of this. And your facts can get twisted and get made into memes and be trending on Twitter if you're not careful. So how are some ways that you can prepare for this?
Sure. So preparing messages for the media and for social media, to Katie's point, first, and this is really, with regard to engaging reporters, it's not always about answering their questions, it's about delivering your message. Now, you don't want to be rude to the reporters and whatever, but preparing your set of messages and knowing that you want to be able to deliver those is important. If a good reporter will use, those uncomfortable silences and allow the person they're interviewing to just keep talking on and on and on. But if you deliver a singular message, if it's the one core message you want to deliver, and that's all you say, that's all that they could use. So it's not always about answering their questions, it's about delivering your message. Kissinger was famous for saying that. Does anybody have any questions for my answers? At his press conferences was basically, I'm just here to talk about this. You're welcome to ask questions, but I'm just going to simply repeat the things I've already said. With that in mind, develop the key messages that you want to deliver. I think it's important when the media calls to get a sense of who else is being interviewed. Have you talked to the fire department yet? Or have you talked to so-and-so? Get a sense of anticipating questions. We all understand human behavior. People have a curiosity. What happened? Why did it happen? Who's to blame? How is this going to, are we going to be sure that this won't happen again? And who's the right spokesperson? Very often, nobody wants to talk to the media. It's our job as the PR folks to get out there and have these kind of conversations. But to my earlier point, those are sometimes looked at like the spin doctor. And sometimes, sorry, CEOs, if you're in the audience, you're the bean counters. So your motivations may be less sincere than your chief medical officer, your director of operations, the head of HR, depending on what the type of situation is. Who is the right person that should be the face of your organization? And really very important, knowing and respecting the deadline of journalists is critical. When you're talking with them, hey, you want to have a conversation with somebody, let me make sure I connect you with the right person. What's your timeline? What's your deadline? How can I get you, connected for the interview or the stand-up, whatever you're doing on that schedule. Fighting emotion with emotion is a great strategy. It's hard to argue with somebody on an emotional level and give them facts, but you should be angry at people who misbehaved or express sympathy for people who've been harmed. And again, I think that this is really important for us as a healthcare organization and putting a human face on a crisis. Having a logo in a building as part of your shot because you wanted to say no comment really doesn't help you protect your brand. It doesn't help move your brand forward. But there are people that care about the people in their communities, that have a sense of what's happening. Put them out there. Humanize that. Put the faces there, not logos, not always the CEO. And it gives you a chance to deliver a message with a level of compassion that can't be conveyed through a press release, certainly no comment, or just stock file footage that they would have to use. As I mentioned before, even engaging and partnering with third parties. There are trade associations, civic groups, elected officials, folks that can help guide you through this. Don't be afraid to reach out to them early on to say, hey, we're facing a bit of a crisis. We respect you, and we want to ask for your opinion, on certain issues to help inform how we deal with this. And be honest 100% of the time. If you don't know an answer, say so. If you don't exaggerate, always tell the truth. It will always come back to you if you don't. I promise you that. And to my earlier point, they'll forget that there was a crisis more faster than they will that you lied. They'll remember that you lied for years, but they'll forget what you lied about, frankly. And again, going back to that number one rule, not always about answering their questions, it's about delivering your message. I'll repeat that because I think it's really important to bring that, let that soak in. There's some media myths that I think are important to understand. Again, we're focusing on media relations, but we'll talk about social media in a second. We, as I mentioned, push this through the media lens because that tends to be where these stories are retold, through the credibility of journalists. They, have deadlines. They won't necessarily wait for all the facts before they report on something. They'll report on what they know when they know it. Context doesn't always matter. They're not always going to play it as I say it. You will be subjectively edited. There are folks that have bias, whether it's political bias or bias toward a particular situation or even an individual. And not all the media is the same. We've actually done post vivum. I prefer those so much more to the post-mortem. The patient lived. So after an event, looking at what happened, looking at even in the different types of coverage. I've seen clients go, before a single press conference with this, a group of different media folks in the audience, and how that gets edited and covered, was different between the different folks. This one felt a little more skeptical. This one felt a little bit more reassuring. So it's important to keep in mind that those are just some of the realities. And it's not that reporters are out to get you necessarily, but it's just the context of, what they're working under in terms of deadlines and how they're filtering some of the information based on what they see and they understand. I think it's important to keep your messages simple and brief. A couple, key points. Accentuate the positive. Nothing is ever off the record. I think that's important to keep in mind. Never say no comment. To my earlier point, you want to really get out there with messages, from a human individual, and conveying that, because at that point you're personifying your brand. Being confident in your expertise, correcting misinformation, I think is really important. Don't feel as though you're being rude by saying, wait a minute, that's not exactly what happened. The facts that we've been able to figure out from this situation shows this. Avoid hypothetical situations. Many times folks are looking for a particular soundbite. They would say, well, what would you do in this situation? Or if you find out that your employee is the one that set the fire, how would you handle that? The hypothetical is only coming from one perspective, and there are so many hypotheticals. Well, who is the employee? Why is the employee? Well, there are just too many variables to speculate in a hypothetical. And if you're quoted, if they just pull that piece out, it's, you're not talking about the facts. You're talking about, well, what could have been. We always recommend avoiding those kind of conversations or questions with reporters. And again, repeating your key messages to make sure that what you want to say is coming across. The facts, the truthful statements, should be out there clearly, simply, 3 key points, and make sure that you repeat them and emphasize those. Avoid jargon. Be brief. Know that this is a very short attention span world that we live in, and so don't go on and on very long. Analogies are very helpful. I think the public understands. We were talking once with a client about a particular housing market and said, well, the housing market's cooled a little bit, but that only means we went from driving 100 miles an hour on the highway to 80 miles an hour on the highway. You can still get a ticket for that. That's pretty fast. Those types of analogies help people understand it, rather than saying, well, we think the housing market might have slowed a little bit. Oh, I guess this is a bad time for me to sell my home, or whatever the issue could be. And again, don't say more than you have to. If you only offer your key messages, that's the only thing that can be quoted or edited. So with that in mind, there's a couple of steering thoughts that we have here. If you're asked a question that brings you to a place, a hypothetical, for instance, if somebody says, here's a hypothetical, how would you handle it if you found out your employee was the one that set the fire? The real issue here is this, or what concerns me even more, or the spirit of what we're announcing today. Again, for those of you that are joining us, take a quick screenshot, or we're happy to share some of these. But these are the steering statements that allow you to, use to segue from the question that you don't want to answer, the hypothetical that you don't want to speculate on, and get you back into delivering the key messages that you want to deliver. So, social media, to Katie's point, this citizen journalism's been here for 20 years. People have, certainly the comment section on any Facebook, post can be wide-ranging and can, as Katie mentioned, turn into memes and other things like that. The first and most important thing, a lot of us use third-party tools like Hootsuite, or even just within Facebook itself, some of the scheduling tools. We can't be out there posting here's what's happening with our bariatric program, and next week we have our wellness clinic, and come see us at the community fair. We put a lot of those things in and we schedule those things out. Stop the presses. Once you've declared that there's a crisis, immediately remind yourself that you have a bunch of these other posts queued. We've seen clients get into a little bit of trouble, just by having a message out there that seems like it's tone deaf for what's actually happening. So if you had a post scheduled on Thursday, but there was a crisis on Tuesday, and you're out talking like it's business as usual, then everybody says, well, what's this all about? Oh, shoot, I forgot that, we had that thing, queued up. A few other tips beyond that. Well, first, Facebook's an extreme, or social media, sorry. a very efficient place to share updates. Much easier to post something there quickly. I have an update, here's another fact, something else we've learned. Putting those things out there, reporters will be looking at it, the public will be looking at it. Much easier to send information out that way than it is an e-blast and certainly a press conference. One thing people overlook, though, is this is a great platform to listen and learn. What's the community's response to what we're saying? To Katie's point, there's a really wide range of different opinions, comments. Folks are going to agree with you, disagree with you. You're never going to please everybody. They're going to turn something into a meme, et cetera. But it's important to think of it as a dialogue, not just a monologue. I have something I want to say, but really listening to what the community's reaction is to that can help you tailor your messages or even your approach to how you're dealing with the crisis.
And I love that last bullet too, and just the idea of being human, because on social media and the internet, it is so easy to forget that there's actual human beings on the other side of these social platforms, especially if it's just a logo of a hospital. People might not really get it, that there's people behind that. So I think that's really important just in general on social media, making it as human as you can and tying it to real people, real faces, video. That's all going to help.
Yeah, no, exactly. I got excited during the Super Bowl because Toyota retweeted something and commented on something. I was like, oh, wow, there's actually a person that saw that, or was it a bot or an AI or something? I wasn't quite sure, but yeah, that there are people behind these different things. Pause before responding to comments. It's tempting when somebody says something that you want to quickly jump in and correct it, or if there's somebody posts something you want to quickly jump in to clarify something. It doesn't always have to be your voice. Again, you're on the side of angels. You are a trusted, respected member of the community. If you pause for a moment, you may find that other folks will come to your rescue. That's not the experience I've had with Dr. XYZ. Sorry that you had a bad experience, but I love him or her, working with him or her. You don't always have to be the one to be the defensive voice when sometimes the community is ready to jump in for you. The other thing, and this is important during a crisis and even looking at how you analyze your response to a crisis or even post-crisis to declare the all clear, what is that sentiment over time? There are tools that you can use that will track this automatically for you, but depending on the size of the community you're in or how deep and robust your social media platforms are, looking at when we post, all the comments were negative at first, and now when we continue to post and share updates, the comments are a little bit more neutral, and a few weeks later, they seem to be a little bit more positive. Looking and tracking that sentiment, what's the tone of the comments, within your post or what other people are posting about you as they're tagging you, can really give you a sense of whether or not it's safe to blow the all clear whistle. You may want to put the crisis behind you, but the public may not be ready to forgive you quite yet. So again, be sure to listen to what's happening on social media and even look to plot those as trends over time to give you a sense of how things are progressing. So thinking ahead, because there will always be a next time. And don't ever quote yourself. Don't ever put yourself on a slide quoting yourself. But if you do, a good chess player does think 3 moves ahead, and it's important not to be so caught up in the moment that you forget about what's happening. Yes, this crisis will pass, things will eventually get back to normal, but thinking about what you're gonna be talking about, how do you make that segue? What's the right timing to go back to business as usual so you don't seem insensitive about, all right, well, that's done, we're gonna go back and promote this service line. Plan for those ramp-up strategies and messages. So it's sometimes can be very all-consuming when you're in a crisis. You may not have the time or capacity, but you really should be making the time to say, how do we, move on? What are the right set of messages so that we can not appear as though we're all about the dollar, as opposed to being sensitive to what happened to people last week or whatever. So think about those messages, plan those transitions, because it will pass. And as I mentioned before, those lessons learned are really critical to get a sense of, how you can learn from and react to the next crisis, because there will be another one. So a few summary remarks as we come to the end of this presentation. PAIR, just all about people, making your patients' lives better. Communicating often, communicating regularly, listening, being human about all this. It's our first pandemic. I think it's okay to make a few mistakes. In summary, be there for your patients, be there for your staff, visitors, whatever you call them, community constituents. They're going to remember how you treated them long after this is over. They're going to remember that you were truthful or not. whether you were compassionate or not, whether you put people before profits, and how you process that information is extremely important because we're all in this together. It's the only segue I could think of at the end of this slide. So a couple parting thoughts, and I'll ask Katie if there's any other questions or comments before we start to wrap up in the next few slides. So if you have any questions or anything, no hypotheticals, please put it in the chat for those of you that are on Zoom, and for those of you that are on our streaming platforms, we'll try to reply to you offline after the webinar. But for folks that registered for this on Zoom, you get a free complimentary copy of our book, Under the Influence, which has an entire chapter, a lot more content than this, dedicated to this. So those will be sent out to you shortly. So thank you for your interest in not only what we have to say here, but for some of that content. We think it's important just to share a lot of these experiences and help folks out not only with our book, but also this webinar series. So as a follow-on to this, we're going to be doing a roundtable on March 3rd at noon. If you're registered for this, you'll automatically get an invitation. This is an open forum. This is not a monologue like we're doing here, but an open forum. And one of the things we wanted to do with this was bring in a special guest. We're going to have Ed Graham that'll be joining us for this. Ed is a former CEO of a very large oncology practice. He had been a former CEO of hospitals and health systems, a regional VP for a national health insurance company. And I thought it would be really interesting for us with that safe harbor to really, learn from Ed a little bit about how does the C-suite process a crisis? What are the priorities? What's important to these, internal audiences? How do you process this information? What does the CEO and leadership team need and want from marketing? How do they manage those key stakeholders? Whether it's legal counsel, board, donors, senior staff, all those kind of things. Everything I've been talking about really is coming from this lens of marketing communications, public relations, community engagement. But the priorities that a CEO would have are going to be different. How do they're going to be looking to protect the organization. We cannot, as the PR people, be dictating exactly how a situation is going to be handled because there are legal, there are financial, there are a lot of other different perspectives. So join us if you're able on March 3rd at noon. It's an open forum. It'll be a conversation. I get that this isn't an easy question, for folks to kind of jump in and say, hey, I'm dealing with this issue, and I'll tell a group of people what we're wrestling with. There, it's probably a safe place to offer hypotheticals. But if you'd like to learn more about that and how the C-suite prepares for a crisis, what their perspectives are, we hope you'll join us for a deeper dive on that. So before we wrap up, I'll ask Katie if there's any questions from the folks on Zoom. Otherwise, we'll just kind of roll.
I do not see any questions in the chat, but you can always reach out to us via email or our website, and we will get back to you.
And in the meantime, we're here for you one chapter at a time. So good plug for the book.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks for joining us.